In the shadows of forgotten wars, where dust-covered files bleed ink like old wounds, lie stories never meant to surface. Steel doors sealed them away, stamped with ciphers and silence, but their echoes seep through the cracks. They speak of vanished convoys, secret orders whispered in candlelit bunkers, and experiments buried beneath ice and time. What remains is not history, but an unfinished riddle, an archive of power and betrayal, waiting for the one willing to listen. On the night of February 11th, 1943, under cover of a brutal Atlantic storm, a British convoy codenamed Operation Albatross departed the naval anchorage at Scapa Flow. It was listed in Admiralty ledgers as a standard transfer of material to Halifax, Nova Scotia, yet the escorts assigned, 2 tribal-class destroyers and a converted escort carrier, were unusually heavy for a shipment described only as miscellaneous engineering supplies. Surviving fragments of internal Admiralty correspondence suggest that Albatross carried not just routine cargo, but a consignment of experimental acoustic countermeasures developed at the Underwater Sound Research Laboratory in Fairlie, Scotland. Known internally as Type 147D noise projectors, these devices were intended to scramble the hydrophones of German U-boats and blind their captains long enough for escorts to prosecute depth charge attacks. To the Kriegsmarine, which relied on wolfpack tactics across the Atlantic, such a weapon threatened their very campaign of strangulation against Britain. The convoy consisted of 6 merchant vessels, all requisitioned for war duty and escorted, initially by HMS Eskimo, HMS Ashanti, and HMS Battler, a small carrier carrying Swordfish patrol aircraft. The surviving voyage orders, filed under ADM 1999-2147, but heavily redacted, indicate a planned route north of the Faroes, skirting the Arctic pack ice, before descending toward Newfoundland. It was a dangerous path, chosen not for safety, but to minimize detection by U-boat patrol lines concentrated further south. The official narrative ends abruptly on February 16th, when the convoy ceased all wireless transmission in a storm recorded as one of the harshest of that winter. The Admiralty declared all 6 ships lost, presumed sunk by weather. Yet subsequent evidence suggests a far darker end. In 1978, a retired Bletchley Park cryptanalyst, Robert Cripps, disclosed that during that same week, several Enigma intercepts referenced a long strike launched from Bannock Airfield in northern Norway, home to Kampfgeschwader 26. The unit, equipped with Heinkel He 111 torpedo bombers, had rarely ventured into the deep Atlantic due to fuel limitations. Yet the decrypts describe a spear mission targeting special cargo ships under heavy guard. Cripps's testimony coincides with fragmentary Norwegian resistance reports noting unusual Luftwaffe fuel shipments into Bannock in early February, preparations consistent with a long-range strike. The reports were dismissed after the war as exaggerations, but when paired with the intercepts, they suggest that Operation Albatross did not fall victim to weather, but to one of the most ambitious Luftwaffe anti-shipping operations of the war. Further, anomalies emerged in 1991 when the National Archives released a series of declassified US Navy liaison cables. One, dated March 2, 1943, from the Office of Naval Intelligence to Washington, references unconfirmed British losses of merchant convoy carrying experimental counter-acoustic devices. This language mirrors the terminology used in ONI bulletins concerning radar and sonar trials, implying awareness of the classified nature of the cargo. Yet the cable is immediately followed by an instruction that all references to Albatross be removed from subsequent weekly summaries. It appears the matter was intentionally buried, its details erased from operational history. Survivor accounts are conspicuously absent. None of the convoy's 742 crewmen were ever recovered. German archives, however, contain a chilling fragment, the war diary of Kapitänleutnant Rolf Manke of U-358, operating west of Tromsø. In his entry of February 17th, he describes hearing distant heavy detonations to the southwest, at a time when his boat was submerged and out of contact. He notes in passing strong wireless activity immediately following the blasts. Manca's account was later struck from Kriegsmarine summaries prepared for post-war interrogation, yet the original log survived in a private collection, surfacing only in the 1970s. If accurate, the detonations may correspond to the attack on Albatross. The Admiralty's silence has fueled speculation that the convoy's cargo was of such sensitivity that its existence could not be admitted. Acoustic decoys like the Foxer had already been deployed on a limited basis, but Albatross reportedly carried advanced prototypes designed to project false signatures and create phantom targets. Such technology, had it entered service in 1943, might have drastically reduced the U-boat threat months earlier than historically recorded. Its loss, therefore, was not just a logistical failure, but a strategic catastrophe, one the Admiralty may have judged better left unspoken. In 2001, a joint British-Norwegian expedition using side-scan sonar reported the discovery of wrecks approximately 280 miles northeast of Iceland, in waters where Albatross might have passed. The shapes suggested cargo vessels, heavily broken by depth and storm. Yet follow-up expeditions were quietly blocked by the Ministry of Defense, citing environmental hazards. Independent researchers claim that one of the sonar images reveals a ship lying split amidships, consistent with torpedo impact, not storm breakup. Without further access, the truth remains obscured beneath miles of water. Today, Operation Albatross exists only in fragments, redacted orders, intercepts, and scattered German references to a vanished enemy convoy. Its very name was erased from naval histories, absent from standard accounts of the Battle of the Atlantic. Yet for those who sift through declassified fragments, the pattern is undeniable. Somewhere in the winter darkness of 1943, an entire convoy carrying the promise of acoustic superiority vanished, struck down not by weather, but by an enemy who should not have been able to reach it. The silence that followed was deliberate, ensuring that the drowned convoy would remain a ghost. In the Atlantic archives, its cargo lost, its sailors unacknowledged, its story left to rot in classified files. In the final months of 1944, as the Wehrmacht reeled under the combined weight of Allied advances in France and Italy, a peculiar file began to circulate within the US Counterintelligence Corps. It bore the innocuous title, CIC Report 14-892-45, and was later filed under the name of Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commander of German forces in Italy. On its surface, the dossier was a routine survey of enemy staff movements during the Italian campaign, but buried within its heavily stamped pages were repeated references to a shadow unit called Sonderkommando Blau, a detachment allegedly tasked with the transfer of unusual cargo across the collapsing Reich. The file's origin lies in an interrogation conducted in Rome on December 29, 1944. The subject was Hauptmann Franz Behrens, a captured German logistics officer attached to 10th Army headquarters. According to the typed transcript, Behrens admitted to overseeing rail consignments through Florence during October, but hesitated when asked about a detachment moving under Kesselring's direct authority. After hours of questioning, he disclosed that a small convoy, operating under the cover of regular engineering supply runs, had transported several sealed crates marked U-235, Leipzig. These crates, he claimed, were moved from Livorno to Verona, under guard by men wearing insignia not of the Wehrmacht, but of the SS technical branch. When pressed for details, Behrens whispered a single phrase, Blau Kommando. The interrogation report was promptly classified. Its references to uranium, U-235, underlined in red pencil by intelligence officers. By early 1945, the Manhattan Engineer District in Washington was already tracking global uranium supplies, with near-obsessive attention, fearful that any fissile material in German hands might accelerate their own nuclear ambitions. Yet no official record exists of this supposed convoy beyond the Behrens transcript. The file vanishes from standard Allied intelligence summaries, only resurfacing decades later in declassified CIC holdings. Corroborating fragments do exist, scattered across Allied intelligence archives. A February 1945 Ultra Intercept, decrypted, at Bletchley Park and filed under CX MSS 351 T44. References: Blue Detachment, a Pennine movement, describing unusual rail traffic through Bologna. Another entry from OSS Field Reports in Switzerland mentions Italian partisans ambushing a German convoy near Modena in late November. Among the destroyed cargo, the partisans claimed, were steel drums filled with black ore, unlike any coal or iron they had seen. These reports were dismissed as confused battlefield observations. Yet when cross-referenced with the Baron's interrogation, the outlines of a buried operation emerge. Kesselring's headquarters in Italy had long been known for its ruthless efficiency. His command staff was skilled at retreat, preserving men and materiel despite overwhelming Allied superiority. But the notion that he oversaw the transfer of fissile material through a collapsing front stretches the boundaries of conventional history. Still, the logistics align. Uranium oxide mined in Czechoslovakia had been routed towards southern Germany through 1944, often via disguised engineering shipments. If Sonderkommando Blau existed, its purpose may have been to move these reserves southward, away from the collapsing Reich heartland, perhaps towards Switzerland for sale, or toward ports for evacuation. One of the most disturbing references comes from a US Army G2 intelligence summary, dated April 4, 1945, discovered only in 1999. It describes the capture of a German train outside Verona carrying technical equipment and 2 wagons of mineral ore. The summary notes that the ore was radioactive, though the word was misspelled and followed by a question mark suggesting uncertainty. The wagons, according to the appended notes, were diverted to Naples under American guard. Yet subsequent shipping manifests from Naples Harbor omit any mention of such material. Where it was taken and why it was excluded from official histories remains unknown. By the late 1940s, references to Sonderkommando Blau had disappeared entirely from Allied records. The few surviving files are inconsistently catalogued, often cross-referenced only with Kesselring's name, despite his denial during post-war interrogation that any such unit existed. His testimony at Nuremberg contained a curious moment. When asked about special staff detachments, he paused for several seconds before replying simply, "There was no such command." Yet the pause was recorded in the minutes, noted by observers as peculiar hesitation. The case resurfaced briefly in the 1960s, when declassified Soviet archives revealed NKVD reports tracking uranium shipments by fascist forces through northern Italy. A particularly striking file, dated February 23, 1945, describes partisan reconnaissance near Lake Garda, observing German convoys loading heavy crates onto barges. The report, forwarded to Moscow, concluded that German atomic experiments may be moving south. Western historians dismissed the NKVD account as Cold War exaggeration, intended to inflate the perceived Nazi nuclear threat. Yet paired with the CIC's suppressed files, the resonance is difficult to ignore. Modern researchers who have examined the Kesselring Files suggest 2 possibilities. The first is that Sonderkommando Blau did indeed transport uranium oxide southward, possibly intended for a last-ditch evacuation by sea. Several U-boats, including U-234, were documented carrying uranium to Japan in the final months of the war. The second possibility is more unsettling, that Allied intelligence quietly recovered the cargo and incorporated it into the Manhattan Project's supply chain. This would explain the silence, the missing Naples manifests, and the absence of surviving ore samples in Germany after the war. The truth may never be known. What remains are fragments. A frightened German officer whispering of Blau Commando, a decrypted intercept of rail movements, an ambiguous G2 summary, and the peculiar omissions of official naval records. Kesselring's reputation as a master of retreat has endured, but the darker question lingers in classified corners of the archive. Was he also custodian of fissile material, moving it across collapsing battlefronts under a cloak of denial? The Kesselring Files stand as one of the most enigmatic shadows of the Italian campaign, too detailed to dismiss as rumor, yet too incomplete to rewrite the history of the atomic race. What is clear is that somewhere in the chaos of 1945, Under the mountains and rail tunnels of northern Italy, a silent convoy carried something far more dangerous than artillery shells, its journey erased by the very victors who uncovered it. In the days immediately following Germany's surrender in May 1945, American units pushing deeper into the ruined heart of the Reich encountered something that official histories later buried under the weight of victory. Among the sprawling files of the Office of Strategic Services, preserved only in fragmentary carbon copies, are reports of firefights and ambushes carried out by uniformed men who should no longer have existed. These men called themselves Werwolf, the guerrilla arm of the Nazi regime, pledged to resist occupation with sabotage, assassination, and terror. Yet the documents suggest something more sinister, that some of these groups operated not as ragged fanatics, but as trained cells engaged in false flag missions designed to ignite discord between the Allies themselves. The most compelling evidence comes from a series of after-action reports filed by the 9th Infantry Division in Thuringia between May 10th and May 14th, 1945. Patrols outside Eisenach recorded attacks by small groups of armed fighters wearing Soviet uniforms. In one particularly detailed report dated May 12th, Captain James Holloway describes his platoon engaging 6 to 8 individuals in Red Army dress, speaking German with heavy accents. 2 Americans were killed before the attackers dispersed into the forests. When the bodies of 2 assailants were recovered, their uniforms were found to be crude imitations, their insignia mismatched, their boots of German make. Holloway's report was passed to division headquarters, where it was stamped, "Provisional, do not circulate." It does not appear in official army casualty summaries for that week. Supporting evidence comes from captured German documents seized in the Harz Mountains. Among them was a cache of papers marked Werwolf Befehl Nr. 47, instructing cells to conduct operations of deception against the foreign occupiers and to strike in ways that confuse alliances. The document, dated April 27, 1945, bears the signature of SS Obergruppenführer Hans Adolf Prützmann, the designated commander of Werwolf. While Werwolf is often dismissed as propaganda, a phantom force conjured to frighten Allies and reassure Germans, the existence of a written directive to sow distrust between Americans and Soviets suggests a more deliberate strategy. The deception was designed not to achieve battlefield success, but to inject suspicion at the very moment cooperation was most vital. The Counterintelligence Corps soon took notice. A memorandum dated May 18, 1945, preserved in Record Group 319, outlines persistent rumors of hostile action staged to resemble Soviet attacks. The memo warns that such incidents may be exploited to fracture Allied command cohesion. Despite the urgency of its language, the memo was marked "File only, no distribution," indicating a decision to keep the matter out of circulation. The political stakes were immense. The fragile alliance between Washington and Moscow was already straining under the weight of occupation zones, reparations, and ideological mistrust. Any suggestion of Soviet hostility could have been disastrous. It was safer, perhaps, to let such reports quietly vanish. Partisan testimonies collected after the war add another layer. A French liaison officer attached to US forces in Germany, Captain Etienne Moreau, later recounted that American patrols near Weimar stumbled upon a hidden cache of uniforms, Soviet and American alike, stored in a barn with weapons and forged documents. Moreau claimed the find was immediately hushed, the items removed by men not of the regular army, but in plain clothes. His testimony, published in a small journal in 1957, went largely ignored, dismissed as anecdotal, yet it resonates with the operational doctrine of Werwolf, which explicitly emphasized sabotage, psychological warfare, and deception over open combat. The Soviet archives, opened briefly in the 1990s, contain NKVD reports that mirror the American accounts. A file dated June 2, 1945, from the Soviet military administration in Saxony, describes a firefight near Jena in which Red Army soldiers were ambushed by men shouting Russian commands but firing German weapons. Upon inspection, several attackers were found to be SS youths, their uniforms crudely altered to mimic Soviet tunics. The report concludes with the phrase, "German fascists seek to provoke conflict between allies." The language is strikingly similar to the suppressed CIC memorandum, suggesting that both sides were aware of the danger, yet unwilling to acknowledge it publicly. Why then has history remembered Werwolf only as a propaganda spectre? The answer may lie in the politics of memory. For the Americans, admitting that organized Nazi resistance continued after surrender would tarnish the image of swift victory. For the Soviets, acknowledging that the Germans attempted to impersonate their troops risked inflaming tensions with Western allies at a delicate moment. Both sides had reasons to suppress, erase, or discredit these incidents. What remained was the sanitized version. Werwolf, as an ineffectual ragtag band of teenagers and fanatics, quickly crushed and of little consequence. Yet the erased casualty reports tell a different story. In US Army medical logs for May 1945, there are unexplained discrepancies. Wounded men listed without corresponding combat engagements, fatalities absent from after-action summaries. Some of these may be administrative errors. Others, as the Holloway report implies, may be victims of skirmishes officially deemed not to exist. The pattern is subtle, but for those willing to trace the gaps, it suggests that Operation Werwolf was more than a myth. It was a shadow conflict, fought not to win battles but to plant seeds of suspicion in the rubble of Germany. Today, the surviving files of Operation Werwolf remain fragmented, redacted reports, overlooked Soviet records, and testimonies ignored by mainstream historians. They describe not the birth of a Nazi insurgency, but the death throes of a regime desperate to poison the peace that followed its collapse. The ghosts of Operation Werwolf linger in these silences, in missing casualty lists, in confiscated uniforms, in directives stamped "Do not circulate." They remind us that even in defeat, the Third Reich sought to manipulate the future, its last weapon deception, its last battlefield the fragile trust of its enemies. In the autumn of 1944, as the Red Army closed on East Prussia and the Allies pressed into France, a quiet but extraordinary order left Berlin under the highest classification, Geheim Reichssache, secret matter of the Reich. The directive, preserved only in fragments in post-war interrogations, was issued to elements of the SS Ahnenerbe, the research institute under Heinrich Himmler, tasked with pseudo-scientific projects ranging from archaeology to advanced technology. This order directed a team of scientists and technicians northward through Norway to the remote Arctic archipelago of Svalbard. Their mission was shrouded in code, identified in Kriegsmarine logs as Unternehmen Nordlicht, Operation Northern Light. What exactly they sought in those frozen wastes remains the subject of speculation, but scattered archives hint at seismic experiments, subglacial transmitters, and weapons trials so unusual that even the SS itself struggled to classify them. The earliest surviving reference to this deployment comes from the war diary of the 13th U-boat flotilla, stationed in Tromsø. On October 22, 1944, the log notes, "Special embarkation of scientific personnel with sealed containers, escorted by U-307 and U-318. The cargo was described as instruments and ore samples, loaded under guard of SS men bearing Ahnenerbe insignia. Local Norwegian civilians later recalled the convoy of trucks carrying steel crates marked with cryptic symbols, geological pickaxes, but also Reich Eagle emblems. The vessels departed northward under Arctic night, their ultimate destination unrecorded, in official naval summaries. Yet intercepted Allied signals, decrypted months later, tracked unusual radio traffic emanating from the Barents Sea region in the weeks that followed. Soviet documents provide a chilling corroboration. In files declassified in the 1990s, NKVD memoranda from Murmansk describe sudden and unexplained evacuations of fishing villages along the Barents coast in November 1944. Entire communities were ordered inland without explanation, sometimes at gunpoint, under the pretext of security operations. Villagers later testified to hearing distant thunder from the sea and feeling the ground shudder. These accounts, dismissed at the time as fear or rumor, were filed under enemy experimental activity. The Soviets, consumed with their push toward Berlin, diverted little attention to the remote north. Yet, their suspicion is preserved in a cable sent to Moscow on November 19th. Enemy may be testing seismic explosives or new transmitters under ice. Activity irregular, requires further surveillance. Captured German records from the SS Ahnenerbe are scarce, many destroyed before the Reich's collapse. But one fragment survived in the interrogation notes of Dr. Wilhelm Trenz, an Ahnenerbe geologist captured in Bavaria in May 1945. Under questioning, Trenz admitted having assisted in Arctic research under Reich orders, describing an expedition to measure polar resonance phenomena using seismic charges and magnetometric instruments. He refused to elaborate, insisting that further detail was classified even within the SS. The interrogation report, marked CIC Interrogation 7234, was quietly shelved. Its details never entered into open trial proceedings at Nuremberg. Trenz was released in 1948 and lived quietly in West Germany, never again speaking publicly of his wartime work. Hints also appear in Norwegian resistance archives. A coded report filed by Milorg agents in December 1944 describes unusual naval traffic between Tromsø and Svalbard, including vessels carrying no cargo but large aerial antennae. Another entry refers to rumors of German wireless stations beneath the ice. These reports, transmitted to London, were acknowledged but never pursued, overshadowed by the more immediate threats of the Battle of the Bulge and the Eastern Front. Yet they remain today as faint traces of an operation otherwise erased from official history. What then was the purpose of Project Ahnenerbe's Arctic expedition? Theories range widely. Some historians argue it was a desperate attempt to exploit mineral resources, particularly rare ores rumored to exist beneath Svalbard's glaciers. Others suggest the project involved geomagnetic research, perhaps linked to long-range navigation or communication. The Soviet interpretation that seismic weaponry was tested finds support in the testimony of villagers who recalled unexplained tremors. Still, others point to intercepted German signals that mentioned polar sender, polar transmitter, a term with no clear technical definition in wartime archives. Whether transmitter, explosive, or experiment in geomagnetic resonance, the project was conducted at enormous cost and secrecy, its traces systematically buried. The expedition appears to have ended in disaster. Kriegsmarine loss records indicate that U-307 failed to return from a mission in late April 1945. Officially listed as sunk by British destroyers, survivor accounts suggest it may have been lost during extraction from the Arctic. A post-war British Admiralty assessment notes only that scientific personnel previously embarked were not recovered. The absence of further records suggests either destruction of evidence or successful concealment by Allied intelligence agencies. Indeed, rumors persist that British and Soviet forces conducted covert recovery missions on Svalbard in the summer of 1945, securing whatever remained before erasing the operation from public record. Today, the story of Project Ahnenerbe's Arctic. Silence survives only in fragments, logs marked with cryptic references, villagers' memories of unexplained tremors, an interrogated geologist's evasive words, and the vanished ships of a flotilla sent north under Reich orders. The documents trail off into silence, leaving only the echo of unanswered questions. What did the SS seek in the frozen wastes of Svalbard? What technology did they attempt to awaken beneath the ice? And why, 70 years later, do archives, in both Moscow and London, remain reluctant to open their files? The Arctic remains quiet, but beneath its silence lies the trace of an operation designed to vanish, an experiment swallowed by snow, preserved only in the margins of classified history. In the early years of the Cold War, as the United States erected its new listening posts along the Florida Keys, a series of intercepted transmissions puzzled analysts at the Naval Security Group in Key West. Beginning in August 1951, bursts of encrypted traffic were recorded emanating from Havana Harbor, transmitted on frequencies unusual for conventional naval communication. The signals were short, precise, and carried the unmistakable cadence of mechanical cipher machines. Yet when the intercepts were analyzed, technicians discovered something extraordinary. The encryption patterns bore the hallmarks not of Soviet equipment, but of Wehrmacht-era Enigma wheels. The initial assumption was error. The German Reich had fallen 6 years earlier, and any surviving Enigma devices were presumed destroyed, seized, or locked in Allied vaults. But the signals persisted, recorded at irregular intervals throughout late 1951 and 1952. Reports filed under NSA predecessor agencies, then still operating under Army and Navy intelligence, classified the traffic as unidentified hostile. What alarmed Washington was the geography. Cuba, a mere 90 miles from the Florida coast, appeared to be hosting an unknown signals network employing obsolete German technology. Declassified CIA memoranda from 1964, released under FOIA, reveal how seriously the matter was taken. One internal briefing, dated January 7, 1952, describes continued traffic from Havana port area, consistent with 3-rotor cipher wheel encoding. Operational profile, consistent with ex-Abwehr or foreign remnant networks. The memo adds, suggest high probability of German émigré involvement, possibly acting as intermediary for Soviet bloc. In other words, the agency suspected that remnants of Nazi intelligence had embedded themselves within Havana's expatriate community, repurposing old networks to channel information to Moscow. The theory gained weight when a defected East German signals officer, Oberleutnant Dieter Brehm, was debriefed in West Berlin in 1953. In transcripts preserved under CIA file WWII, Brehm stated that former Abwehr specialists had relocated to the Caribbean after 1945, carrying both cipher equipment and contact lists. He identified Havana as a key node used to launder intelligence between Latin America and Eastern Bloc recipients. According to Brehm, U-boats operating out of Bordeaux in the final months of the war had transported not only material but personnel and archives, some of which were hidden in neutral or semi-neutral ports before Germany's surrender. Havana, with its thriving German merchant presence and corrupt political networks, offered sanctuary. The matter was further complicated by maritime intelligence. In 1946, US Navy patrols documented rumors of at least 2 German submarines unaccounted for after the war's end. Though many claims of ghost U-boats surfaced in the immediate post-war years, one in particular, U-530, was known to have surrendered in Argentina months after Germany's collapse, raising questions of extended missions. Files in the Office of Naval Intelligence hinted at the possibility that other submarines had dispersed material and personnel across South America and the Caribbean. If true, Havana may have been both a staging post and a communications hub for the exfiltrated networks. By 1952, the Havana Intercepts were no longer isolated curiosities. Naval monitoring stations across the Caribbean reported similar bursts, often triangulated to freighters docking at Havana, Santiago, and occasionally Port-au-Prince. The traffic invariably followed the same structure: shortwave bursts lasting under 2 minutes, encrypted by a rotor machine, and concluded with the same 3-letter group, BLA. Analysts speculated this was either a call sign or a remnant of German cipher protocol. The codename Operation Blue Lantern was assigned to the investigation, but the project remained classified at the highest level. The CIA deployed case officers into Havana under commercial cover. Their surveillance uncovered several German expatriates of interest, many connected to shipping firms with suspicious financial irregularities. One, a former Abwehr officer named Otto Jürgens, operated a trading company moving goods between Havana and Veracruz. Another, Dr. Emil Rathke, an engineer linked to pre-war research on radio beacons, was observed meeting Cuban naval officers. None were ever arrested. Files suggest that the Cuban government of Fulgencio Batista quietly tolerated these expatriates, either through ignorance or corruption. The signals continued uninterrupted until 1955, when they abruptly ceased for nearly a year. The explanation came later from another defector, a Cuban intelligence officer who fled to Miami in 1961. In his debrief, he claimed that in 1956, Soviet handlers absorbed the remnants of the German network, phasing out obsolete Enigma devices in favor of modern cipher equipment. The Havana Intercepts, he asserted, had represented the final years of a shadow network that bridged the defeated Third Reich and the rising Soviet bloc. In his words, the Germans carried the gold, the knowledge, and the codes. The Russians paid for all three. The claim aligned with persistent rumors of Nazi gold smuggled through South America into Caribbean vaults, financing both escapes and covert operations. To this day, no physical evidence of the Havana Enigmas has surfaced. The cipher machines themselves were never recovered, and the individuals named in surveillance files disappeared into obscurity. The NSA maintains recordings of the original signals, archived under restricted holdings, but has released only fragments. Scholars who have heard the tapes confirm the unmistakable click pattern of rotor encryption, the same rhythm familiar to Bletchley Park veterans. The Havana Intercepts remain one of the Cold War's strangest anomalies. The voice of a dead Reich echoing across the Caribbean night, carrying secrets not for Berlin, but for Moscow. Whether they transmitted stolen V2 blueprints, South American financial intelligence, or simple logistical chatter, their existence speaks to a hidden continuity, the survival of networks built in wartime, repurposed in the ideological battles that followed. It was a reminder that the fall of Berlin did not end the machinery of shadow war. It merely shifted its operators from one patron to another. In the classified silence of Operation Blue Lantern, the United States glimpsed how the ashes of the Third Reich could still smolder, glowing faintly through the radios of Havana. The deeper we search, the more the silence resists, like a wound refusing to heal. What was hidden was never meant for light, and yet the fragments insist on being heard. Crates left unopened, signals half decoded, footprints fading into snow. These stories bleed into the present, not as answers but as warnings. The archives close again, but the question lingers in the dark. What other truths still wait, locked away, beneath the weight of history's silence?